The rescue mission, the emergence of basically unmanned vehicles, both air, land, and sea, is a reflection of the transformation of modern warfare.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Heroes Path podcast. I'm Colonel John Fenzel, and there are two events that I'd like to talk about right off the bat. And all of these, by the way, are in the same 24 hours. They define the week and they define the moment in the war that we're in right now. Last night, an AH-64 Apache helicopter, the Army's premier attack aircraft, was shot down near the Strait of Hormuz while patrolling over that waterway. And this morning, Trump posted on social media that both crew members are safe, they're uninjured, and they were rescued within 2 hours by an unmanned Navy drone boat. And then he wrote, the United States must, of necessity, respond to this attack. We'll talk about that. And hours before that Apache went down, Trump was leaving the NBA Finals in New York and telling reporters the two sides are in the final stages of a very good deal, he said, and that it could be signed in, quote, 2 or 3 days. A deal in 2 or 3 days, downed Apache in the same night. A president who says we must respond to the attack, and then says also that the deal is almost done. Those two statements are coming from the same man about the same adversary within 12 hours of each other. So welcome to day 102. Now, Jeff, this isn't an isolated incident. We're going to talk about Israel and Iran trading the worst fires since the April ceasefire. We're going to talk about the Iranian response, and we're going to talk about a lot of other issues here. But thanks very much for joining us once again. You've been with us every week of this war to provide all of the insights that you won't get anywhere else. And so here we are on day 102. This is one of the most consequential weeks that we've had. Why don't you take it from there, Jeff?
First of all, I think probably by now people are getting used to the fact that President Trump can speak out of both sides of his mouth within the same sentence. And I think in this case, everything that he said bears an element of truth. The negotiations have been continuing. Pakistan remains the most visible and critical mediator, and there really is a draft memorandum of understanding in which there are a number of issues that remain unresolved. One question is the time frame in which the Iranians would produce and then water down their 60% enriched uranium stockpile, about 100 pounds. The Iranians want 90 days to do it under IAEA supervision. The U.S. is demanding 60 days. It's an issue that can be resolved by just splitting the difference, frankly. And then there's the issue of the tolls and the open access again to the Straits of Hormuz. And Tom Pickering, who's one of the really most senior still living American diplomats, served in many decades of service under both Democratic and Republican presidents, had a piece earlier this week that presented ways in which to get around this precedent of allowing countries to create a toll system for major international waterways, which would really fundamentally overturn the laws of the sea. And there's other ways that you could skin that cat through tariffs on exports and things like that. So I think that genuinely President Trump needs to get out of this war because of the economic consequences, because of the November elections, things we've been talking about for weeks. And the Iranians basically have a kind of a limited time frame in which they can continue to operate under the conditions of the blockade and related things. The wild card factor is Israel. Israel and the United States now have serious divergences in terms of what their objectives are and what their minimal requirements are for ending the war. Trump wants out with a reasonable agreement with Iran, and he can spin that domestically to basically gain some sort of benefit from it, despite a lot of media skepticism. But Israel, facing election by no later than October 22nd, needs to either compel the United States to go all the way or continuously sabotage any kind of final peace agreement between Iran and the United States to keep this thing going in the hopes that momentum will ultimately twist in his direction, and the U.S. can be dragged into a full-blown, much larger regime change, which is what he needs from Israel's standpoint. The rescue mission, the emergence of basically unmanned vehicles, both air, land, and sea, is a reflection of the transformation of modern warfare.
One of the things, as we talk about this, I believe that Apache was shot down by a drone, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
And
Forgotten.
then the pilots were rescued by a drone boat.
Exactly right.
When you talk about the transformation of warfare, it's
Exactly.
very well said. We're in a whole brave new era here.
And it means that things like aircraft carriers, large fixed bases in places like the Middle East, like the Persian Gulf, are going to have to be reevaluated and rethought based on the fact that we've seen a revolution in warfare, revolution in military affairs that's very real, irreversible, and it has the virtue of basically replacing a lot of really big ticket items with drone technologies that cost enormously less amounts of money and are effective.
What's interesting too, you say, okay, why were there Apaches there? What were those Apaches doing? Well, that Apache's operational role tells you something why it was there. Apaches have been a key asset in forcing the naval blockade, right? On all the Iranian oil shipments and the tankers. And it's also been used by the UAE to shoot down Iranian drones as well. So it's the kind of environment in which accidents and miscalculations and deliberate acts are really indistinguishable in real time. CENTCOM knows that. And that's why they said that this whole incident has been under investigation rather than saying that it happened. We all know it happened. But seeing, first of all, how it was shot down, and then the fact that that crew were on the ground for about, I think, 2 hours before they were rescued by this unmanned drone. It was the Navy's Task Force 59 that did it. And the boat itself, it's a uncrewed drone boat. It's called a Corsair, 7.3 meter autonomous vessel, and it's built by Saronic Technology. So we can all Google that and see what it actually looked like, probably, I would imagine. Really just an interesting, fascinating development. Jeff, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but can you talk a little bit about the War Powers resolution and that vote that happened just recently?
Yeah, sure. There was a vote in the House. A number of Republicans cast their votes and delivered a narrow majority. A number of other Democrats and Republicans didn't vote. There were not a total of 435 votes cast. Mm-hmm. And so some people, probably facing very tight re-election campaigns, did not want to be strongly on the record one way or the other, given that about 60+% of the American people really are now looking for this war to be brought to an end. And it's been a process inch by inch where the narrow defeats that we've seen, particularly over the first 60, 70 days, reached a point now where anybody in Congress who respects the Constitution and understands the history of the War Powers Resolution knows that despite what Hegseth claimed about we're in a ceasefire, it doesn't count towards the clock. That's just simply not true.
Yeah.
And I think that Trump did something else that is going to backfire on him, namely moving to eliminate 2 sitting members of the Senate and 1 sitting member of the House of Representatives, all longstanding Republicans. And Trump ran candidates against them in the case of Thomas Massie, who was right from the outset a co-sponsor of the War Powers Resolution with Ro Khanna. It was the largest amount ever spent on a single primary election, somewhere in the vicinity of $35 million, in which a significant amount of AIPAC money, the official Israeli lobby money, went into defeating Massie because he had been a strong critic of the Gaza war and what was going on in southern Lebanon.
And Massie,
in fact, he was...
Yeah, and Massie was one of those 4 Republicans that had voted against the war. And of course, then also you had Tom Barrett of Michigan, Warren Davidson of Ohio, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. But Massie, notably, as you just mentioned, lost his Republican primary to Trump's endorsed candidate. So here's a man who voted his conscience when he had really nothing left to lose, right?
Yeah, there was a little snafu. Trump endorsed him 4 days before he even announced he was a candidate. So you get the time sequence there that.
We talked a little bit before we went on here about the NDAA. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that with all of the attention that's been given, obviously, to the Iran and now Lebanon situations, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the bill that every Congress has to pass because that's the authorization to provide the money for the Pentagon. The fiscal year 2027 is about $1.13 trillion defense budget. And buried within that, in what's Section 22, is a provision for the full integration of the entire Israeli defense and high-tech R&D industry into the U.S. military industrial base. And I think that I would characterize this as Netanyahu's Plan B. A member of Congress from Indiana was in Israel on May 27th, meeting with Netanyahu, flew back home and issued a proposal that was characterized as a gradual end of the U.S. military aid to Israel. But the part that was less covered in the media is that instead of that sort of at least transparent process of public debate over those funds, now permanent integration of the entire Israeli military industrial sector into the U.S. military industrial and national security base makes the entire process go from transparent to completely opaque and gives the Israelis an even greater leverage. Now, one of the ways in which there's been pushback against it is that first NBC News and then a few days later, the New York Times reported that the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency have both issued warnings that Israeli espionage against the United States is in a greatly escalated period right now. They've been attempting to tap the phones of Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They've attempted to plant bugs in the U.S. Embassy in Israel and other places. And a lot of people will probably shrug their shoulders and say, what's new? But the fact is that the leak of this in a high-profile way to mainstream media is clearly the efforts of some people on the inside to throw a roadblock in the way of this complete integration of Israel into our national security structures. It's beyond what we have with Canada, Britain, and Australia, who are part of our national technology and industrial base. This is really opening up the keys to the kingdom to the Israelis in a way that's completely unprecedented and without any kind of even remote comparison to our special relationship with Britain or anything else, or Five Eyes, or any of those things.
Yeah. And I guess Netanyahu will be in the audience for the UFC Freedom 250 event in the back lawn of the White House on Sunday, June 14th.
By the way, would like to see him and Trump in the ring together.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because of course, right next to it, you've got the whole east wing of the White House that's been torn down. And the UFC middleweight champion, Sean Strickland, was banned from the fight because of critical comments that he made about both Netanyahu, Israel, and Epstein. And
yes.
So it's just an interesting kind of politicization, I guess you could say.
Yeah, the whole idea that you're having an MMA to celebrate our 250th anniversary of our republic is pretty repugnant in the first place.
Yeah. Jeff, we'll stop there. There's a lot that we'll be talking about here in the weeks ahead. But here we are at 102 days. 13 American service members have been killed. 2 Apache pilots that were rescued by that sea drone in the dark over the Straits of Hormuz just last night. Right. What the president says is about 2 to 3 days away. And a response, he says, to that is necessary to an attack by the same party he's about to sign with. So this is a phrase from the military. We've always said that the enemy always gets a vote. In this case, both the adversary and the allies get a vote. Iran's vote is the Apache. Israel's vote is Sahia, right outside of Beirut.
Yes, exactly.
And then, meanwhile, the president of the United States is trying to close a deal while both votes are still being cast. So it's not a criticism. I think that we've been pretty objective throughout all of this. It's really a description of what governing looks like when a war doesn't end with the schedule of the people who start it.
Right.
But Jeff, we're, I think, 6 weeks in, and every week you've been right. So thank you very much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure, John.
Yeah. To our listeners, the deal that gets signed isn't the deal that's going to end the war. We said that last week. Watch what comes after the signature that does possibly come here in the coming week. The Dahlia equation and the Apache response are the first two items of that next chapter. But this is Colonel John Fenzel. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed. Thanks for listening to the Heroes Path podcast. Bye right now.